Okay, so you have it this week's parsha, the second portion of Deuteronomy. Hanan Moshe repeats some of the most important principles of Judaism. He repeats the stories of the greatest revelation, revelation at Sinai. He repeats the Ten Commandments. He talks about the concepts that have become the foundation of the Hasidic idea that Hashem is everywhere. Of course, it's in the Torah, but with the Hasidic spice, as maybe we'll talk about. And he mentions, Moshe says the word Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel. The Lord is our God, the Lord is one, which is the most important principle or statement of faith within Judaism. And it's to the extent that we're commanded in the Shema itself, the Torah itself tells us to say it twice a day and morning and night. And there's so much to talk about the Shema, but I think as however much you talk about it, it's important to talk about it and think about it and even reiterate the old ideas because it's obviously a very important mitzvah and it captures what it means to believe in God and what it means to be a Jew. And there's so much to talk about. So what I want to do today, as I mentioned, is maybe talk about this very simple statement. Hashem is one. Hashem echad. Very beautiful. What does that mean? And in some ways ask, has the meaning expanded or evolved over time? In other words, one could be different, could mean different things, as we're going to hopefully demonstrate. And the meaning maybe it always had the same meaning, but the understanding of people has evolved to expand the oneness to even greater applications. So that's really what we're going to do. Think about the simple meaning, think about the philosophical meaning from Maimonides, and think about the Kabbalistic Hasidic meaning, all in that same word, one. And as a bonus, we could think about how um, as a bonus, we could think about how the blessings before the Shema maybe articulate this point. Okay, but let's think about this for a second. The first question you want to ask is not you want to ask. What's interesting about the Shema is that it's the only mitzvah, I think, that the mitzvah is to do it twice every day, both morning and night. In other words, there are mitzvot that you do once a day, or there are mitzvot that are not related to time. Like whenever you want to do something, for example, whenever you want to eat, you thank Hashem after you eat. There's nothing to do with day or night. Um, the mitzvah to say something twice a day is only the Shema, right? Today we also have prayer, but the original mitzvah to pray doesn't divide that way. The original mitzvah to pray is either some people understand it to mean whenever you want to talk to God, speak to God. So then it's nothing to do with time bound. Maimonides says it's every day, but it's once a day, right? But the notion that you have one day and one night, I'm sorry, once a day and once a night, and that's the mitzvah, that is very unusual. Now, there's in the Shema itself, we also talk about the mitzvah of studying the Torah, right? Teach it to your children, speak the words of Torah. And speaking to the words of Torah is an interesting contrast to the Shema. How so? Because the real mitzvah, I ask you a question. When is the mitzvah? When do you have to study Torah? The answer is always. Always, you always have to learn Torah. Now, what does always mean depends on the person. In other words, some person has more time, so he has to learn more. Some person is very busy, so the Talmud says that even saying one sentence in the morning and one sentence at night is already enough because you're busy. And with legitimate, you're not busy scrolling the internet, but you're legitimate, you have legitimate responsibilities. And it's all based on a verse in Joshua where the prophet tells Joshua, the angel tells Joshua, V'hagita bo yomam v'layla. You should meditate in it day and night. But here you also have the idea of day and night. But the day and night by Torah study is different. Day and night just means always. And that's why there is no difference in day and night. You don't have to, it's just always. So you always study Torah. The obligation is always. Okay. Shema is this mitzvah that incorporates night and day. So that is an entry point that's different and interesting and it basically is a key into what's really happening with the Shema. So that's introduction number one. Keep this in mind that we're going to circle back, especially when we get to the Hasidic view, we're going to circle back to this concept how the Shema is divisible. It's divided. The mitzvah is two separate mitzvahs, two distinct mitzvahs. I don't want to say separate, but two distinct mitzvahs, morning and night. Okay, so that's introduction, just to keep us, I don't want to forget about this. What is the meaning of Hashem Echad, God is one? So the simple interpretation, and you see this evidence for this throughout the Torah, and you see classic commentators are say so explicitly, that the mitzvah is Hashem Echad, God is one, meaning, first of all, there's no other gods. That's the most basic thing. There are no other gods. There's one God. There's one source of power. And we could talk about this for an hour about the ramifications of this idea. Because if there's multiple sources of power, then there's no one definition of, for example, one definition of what morality is. Because if you have a pagan system where you have many gods, so yes, your God thinks that it's not a good idea for me to kill, but maybe there's a God of war who actually likes it, right? So you can't come and say we have one universal code for everybody. That's going to be the basis of civilization, unless you have the concept that there's one arbitrator of what morality is, and that's the one God. But if there's multiple gods, then there's multiple moralities or multiple systems, and there's no one that's all inclusive. In addition, if you have multiple gods, then you have what you can create. You have what you had later with religious wars, is that my God just cares about my group. My God doesn't care about your group. In fact, he's opposed to your group. So that's, in fact, either allows or encourages the concept of the division between people and ultimately warfare between people. Because my God is only concerned with my group, and your God has a different God. Now, when you come to Judaism, Hashem Echad, God is one. There is only one God. There is only one concept, one source of morality. And therefore, it's no surprise that what Judaism teaches is that everybody was created in the image of God. Not certain people, not the chosen people, not the Jewish people, not the people that believe in God. Everybody was created in the image of God. Adam and Eve are created in the image of God, and that includes not only them but their descendants, because that's what the Torah says. Zeh Sefer Todat Adam. This is the book of the descendants of man when God made man in His image. So the point of the matter is that when you have that concept, a simple concept of Echad, meaning there's one God, ultimate power, ultimate source of everything, and that has ramifications, like I said, that it creates there's morality, and that morality is all inclusive. So that's on a simple definition of what one God means. Monotheism is. Okay. But you don't really need the okay. Now within that, there's a sub-concept, and this is a fascinating debate about whether this mitzvah applies only for the Jewish people or for all people, all of humanity. And this is a fascinating debate. The unity of God as excluding what the sages would call, what the early commentators would call shituf. Shituf means to mix in or partnership. In other words, what happens could you believe that God is the God, but there are also other gods? In other words, God is the supreme God, but there are also smaller sources of power that sort of work under him. Maybe God is all powerful and the original mover, but maybe there's the sun and the moon and other forces of nature that have power as well. And for the Jewish person, all commentators explain that it's prohibited, but many of the commentators say it comes from Shema, and that's why Shema Yisrael. So in other words, when you say that God is one, you mean not only is there one all-powerful God, but that God does not share the power with any other lesser force. So it's not like God and something else are combining to lead the world. So so what we call the technical term is shituf, combination or partnership. So one God, also just to summarize, one God in the simple interpretation means there is one God, there are no others, and not meaning the ultimate source of power is only one. And then we even expand it further to mean for the Jewish people, that includes that God does not share with anybody else. Now, Gentiles may or may not have to believe in that. It depends who you ask. And then has ramifications for other faiths. Are other faiths fully monotheistic? Maybe they're not for Jews. Maybe they are for Gentiles. That's already a broader discussion. But the simple level, what I'm trying to get to is when you close your eyes and you say the Shema, you say Hashem Echad, God is one, meaning there's no other gods. One way or the other, there's no other gods. And that's the conventional understanding. Okay. Now you come a little time advances and the understanding of God advances. And you get the next stop, we stop at Maimonides. And Maimonides talks about the idea of Hashem Echad in his philosophical works, but even in his work of halacha. And Maimonides goes to war to say that God, for example, there was this common conception that even God has a body, maybe not a physical body, but a spiritual body. God has a body. The Torah says God has hands, God has feet, God has eyes. And Maimonides, in his work, talks about even in the Mishnah Torah, in his halachic work in the beginning, the foundations of the Torah, he talks about how we have to believe that God is undefined, is not corporeal, he has no body, and part of that means he's not comprised of many details. So you can't think about God. God has this aspect and that aspect, because once you're going to say God is comprised of details, it's not oneness. And there are, again, philosophical ramifications and spiritual ramifications of what's so terrible if you're going to say that God is like a composite. He's composed of different details, right? A person, you could say that. I could say a person is one, but you're one person, but you have many parts and you have trillions of cells and you have many limbs, and all those parts come together to create a oneness. So um, when you say God is one, the simple interpretation means there's one God, but it doesn't tell you anything about what type of oneness he is. Maybe he's one like a person that has many parts to it. And Maimonides spends a lot of time and energy saying, no, God has no parts. God is what he calls simple unity. Simple meaning not complicated, not complex, not many details. And the reasons for that are many. Once you have many details, then it's not true oneness. And some of the ramifications become, okay, so who composed these details together? There has to be a source bringing these details together. Anything that's composed is going to be decomposed, right? Um, if you're composing different things, then each one is limited. And so basically you're taking different limited parts and putting it together, you're not going to escape the limitation. So he spends a lot of energy. We'll take Bob's question in a second. But the bottom line is, this is the second definition. Second definition is one means one, but a simple unity. Go ahead, Bob.
Um, Interestingly and ironically enough, our main credo is the Shema, and it's talking about oneness. And yet, on the other hand, we as Jews are always considered the other, and we have distinction from other people. So,
Right. Right.
isn't it ironic that as we perseverate on oneness, we
Yeah.
talk about being a chosen or another people, which
Yes.
leads to a lot of problems for us as we see in this day
Yes.
and age.
Yes. So let me just address that very, very briefly. Maybe we'll come back to that later. I don't want to talk about it now within Maimonides because that highlights the other points. But even if you speak Rashi, right? Let's look at Rashi for a moment. And Rashi is quoting the Medrash. Shema Yisrael, Hero Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, God is our God, Hashem Echad, God is one. Now that's a very nice statement. It's beautiful. Our God is one God. But the Medrash, and Rashi quotes it, focuses on the statement and says, you know something? It's actually a little bit contradictory. Why? Because when you say Hashem Elokeinu, when you say Hashem is our God, that is making it exclusive. It's our God and not the God of others. You're saying he's our God. Our means us. And who's us? Us is not all of humanity. How do I know? Because the beginning of the sentence is Shema Yisrael, Hero Israel. So the audience is the Jewish people, the children of Israel. And we're saying the Jewish people, we're saying Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord is our God as in our exclusive. And yet, the second half of the statement says, Hashem Echad, God is one. God is one means it's not exclusive, it's for everybody. So this is a problem that the Medrash points out, or Medrash goes straight to the answer. But the point is, this tension between what Bob is pointing out, is God ours or is God universal? And the way the Medrash answers it is interesting. Again, it's not the only way to approach it, but it's an interesting approach. The Medrash says, Moshe is talking to the people 3,000 years ago. 3,000 years ago, very few people believed in the oneness of God. So what Moshe is saying is as follows: Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord who now is our God. Meaning right now, yes, we believe in one God, but who is the audience that accepts this? Who is the audience that buys into this? Now it's only us. Now it's very small. But Hashem Echad, but ultimately, In the Messianic era, God will become the one God, meaning everybody will accept him. So what this Medrash is pointing to, I think, is what Bob is talking about. Bob is talking about, yes, on one hand, God is ultimately going to be one, but we're saying that's a process that takes time throughout history to reach that. Now, of course, he's the one God, truthfully, objectively, but in people's perception, God, as in people serve him or people acknowledge him, we're not talking about the objective reality. We're talking about what people perceive. Right now, he's not the one God. Because right now there's division. People don't recognize him. People don't see the peace between people. When Mashiach comes, you'll have the recognition of one God, and the ramification for that is if we're all one, if we're all connected to the one God, then the ramification is peace. And that's why we conclude every day the prayer 3 times a day. We conclude from the prophet. I forget which prophet. I should know this. Maybe Micha. I forget. I'm going to go check it up right now because it's embarrassing that I don't know. What do we say at the end of the Aleinu prayer? We say, Bayom hahu yiyeh Hashem echad u'shmo echad. On that day, in the Messianic era, God will be one and his name will be one. What does that mean? It means right now, God is not one. What does it mean God is not one? Of course, God is one. Yeah. It means right now, not everybody recognizes the oneness. Who says this? Which prophet is this? Let's find him right now. I said Micha, that was a mistake. Zechariah, right? Zechariah, from the last prophets, second to last prophets who lived together. The last 3 prophets lived together and prophesied together. Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, the beginning of the second temple. He says, in that day, God will be one. Right? So that's the tension here that we have. Hashem Elokeinu, now he's our God. Who's our? People who recognize him. But that awareness is not universal. Hashem Echad, when Mashiach comes, everyone's going to recognize him. So you're right. Right now, there's still division. And right now, there is still separation in the notion of the idea that everybody's accepting the oneness of Hashem. But that's just what I'm saying right now. Later, I'm going to say more when I get to the Hasidic interpretation. Okay, to summarize up to this point, because we're trying to advance chronologically. You start out and you say, what's the big idea of Judaism? The big idea of Judaism is that God is one. There's only one God. Source of everything is one God. Okay, beautiful. We developed this idea further, meaning it was always true, but it wasn't articulated. And therefore, there were people before the times of Maimonides that say, no, God could have a body, God could have a form. That takes away the infinity. But when you say Hashem Echad, God is one, the Torah doesn't give enough information of what that means. Maybe God is one, but he's finite, he's limited. Maimonides is saying, no, the true God is transcendent, limited, limitless, and therefore you can't say he's comprised, because if you're comprised, meaning you have 2 parts that are limited, 2 finite parts cannot make infinity. Two finite doesn't equal infinity. So Maimonides then says we have to believe that God is simple and pure oneness. In simple English, it means he's infinite. He's not defined, he's not comprised. Now, Maimonides goes to the extreme. Maimonides says, if you don't accept this, not you. He says, someone who doesn't understand this, if someone says that God is corporeal, that God has a body, then he is a heretic. That's what Maimonides says. And it's fascinating because the people that disagree with Maimonides, or great sages of the time that commented on his work, for example, the Ravid, Rabbeinu Avraham ben David, who was much older than him, and he commented on his book, and sometimes he writes very sharp against Maimonides, but you have to understand that there's just the fact that he's commenting on Maimonides' book was a very big endorsement of Maimonides. So that's an endorsement of Maimonides. But in any case, the Ravid says people who were greater than Maimonides, believe that God has a body. So how could he refer to them as heretics? So in other words, this was a common perception that God is one, okay, but God is not infinite. God has form. It doesn't mean he has a physical body, but it means he has definitions. He has, whatever a spiritual body means, but a body means limitation. And Maimonides, like I said, goes to war against this notion, and he fights, and he talks about it, and he convinces people, and ultimately that becomes the normative Judaism. Today, you can't. Once Maimonides wrote what he wrote, it's beyond the pale of Jewish belief to say that God has a form, and God has a limitation, or God is comprised. So Maimonides won the battle. But that's again the next definition. So one means no other gods. One means simple one is comprised, not comprised of many details, but but undefined. The oneness is simple, undefined. In simple English, there's no limit to it. In simple English, it means infinite oneness. And so that's Maimonides. And here we get to here we get to the Hasidic view, which is probably based on the Kabbalistic view, but articulated in the Hasidic view in a very powerful way, and very powerful, but also very radical. So today it's not as radical because we've been here for or Hasidic movement has been around for 300 years, but even today it's radical, and and again, the ramifications are profound. So what does it mean? We close our eyes and we say, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. God, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And so far, like I said, we say one means no other gods. Then one is expanded to mean there's nothing. God is a simple oneness, meaning the type of oneness is not the oneness of a human being, for example, that is one that is has many parts to it, composed of many parts, but it's a simple oneness. And like I said, that basically equals infinity. Okay. What is the Hasidic movement? The Hasidic movement also based on verses in this parsha. So there's a verse in this parsha that's famous because um, we say it on Simchat Torah, we say it every day when we take out every time we take out the Torah. You have been shown to know that the Lord is God in the heaven above, on the earth below. Ein od, there is nothing else, or there's no more. Let's be fair to the translation. B'yadaita hayom, you should know today, take it to heart. We also say it in the Aleinu, also from this week's parsha. All the most important principles of Judaism are in this week's parsha. Know today, take it to heart that the Lord is God, the heaven above and the earth below, nothing else. Okay, what does that mean? That means to say there's nothing else or nothing in addition, depending how you want to translate it. So again, what does that mean? So again, you have the simple interpretation and you have the Kabbalistic Hasidic interpretation. The simple interpretation is we're talking about God. So when you say God is the Lord, heaven above and the earth below, there is none in addition, there is none else. You mean there are no other gods. That's what the verse is saying. Moshe is reiterating to us and telling us there are no other gods. The Hasidic movement, the Baal Shem Tov says, 1 second. That's not exactly what it says. If you think about it, it doesn't say Ein Od, meaning it doesn't say there's no other gods. What it really says is Ein Od, there is nothing else or nothing in addition. In other words, what the verse is saying, the Lord is in heaven and on earth, or Ein Od, there is nothing else, there is nothing outside of him. Meaning, based on the Hasidic idea and the Hasidic doctrine that we spoke about when we studied the second part of the Tanya, there has to be a perpetual creation. In other words, the conventional interpretation is God creates, and God creates the world and brings the world in existence. But once the world is in existence, the world has its own independent existence because the world now is a creation and it's on its own. So, right, you have a child. The child is its own person. You make a piece of furniture. Now has its own life, or it's separate from you, and then you can go home. The Hasidic interpretation says no. The world is something from nothing. In other words, the world itself, the creation itself cannot exist. It's only here as a result of the divine energy constantly bringing it into creation, into existence. They call this hithavut midit, constant creation. And philosophically, they explain why that has to be. Because when you can take one existence and change it to another existence, and then it's on its own. But essentially, what you're doing in that case is you're forming. You're taking a piece of wood and making a bookcase. You're changing the form. Changing the form you don't have to constantly do. But if you're creating something and you're creating something new, that novelty is not going to last. It's going to revert back to its old state. So you have to actually continuously create that. So for example, if you want to fight the force of gravity, you throw something up in the air, okay, you can fly a little bit, but ultimately it's going to fall back down. So you're going to need something to keep so things fall back to their natural state unless there's a force working upon it. And essentially what we're saying is the world essentially is nothingness. Because it's ex nihilo, it's something from nothing. So everything is nothing. For something to exist, it's because God has to constantly make it exist. So that's the Hasidic doctrine of perpetual creation. Where does that leave us when we talk about the Shema? Where that leaves us is if you're going to say that everything cannot exist outside of God, because again, it has no independent existence because if God stops creating it, it ceases to exist. then when you say Hashem Echad, God is one, what you're really saying is ultimately there is only one. There's nothing outside the oneness. There's no multiplicity. It's not like there's God and there's creation. Because if you say there's God and there's creation, then creation has its own independent existence and creation does not. So what are we saying? There is only one. Well, how could you say there's always one? I see the creation, and I see in the creation, I see multiplicity to in unfathomable multiplicity. But we're saying yes, but ultimately it's all one because it's all included in the oneness of God because it doesn't have an independent existence. It exists only because God creates it. So essentially, when we say Hashem Echad, we're saying there is nothing outside the oneness of God. So I'm going to elaborate upon this and talk about this, talk about the ramifications, but just to summarize up to this point, the expanding definition of one. The simple definition is there is one God, there are not many gods. The second definition is there is one God, meaning God himself is one, but a simple unity that is not comprised or composed of different details, because that would take away from the infinity. The third definition, the Hasidic definition, is God is one means there is nothing outside his oneness. And you understand that the ramifications of that are profound. Because if there's nothing outside of his oneness, then everything that we and the other person and the tree and every existence and every experience in this world are not outside of the oneness of God. And that creates a unity between the creation. It creates a unity between creation and God. And it puts our perspective of what is reality that it alters that as well. So essentially, that's the three levels of oneness of God, no other gods, oneness, type of oneness that God is. God himself is not comprised of many details. And ultimately, Hashem Echad is that the Hasidic view is there's nothing outside the oneness of God. Of course, this is a big idea and controversial then and controversial now. Now people accept it and say it, but to think about the ramifications is profound. So let's see if we can unpack this. Go ahead, Dr. Bob, please.
Just sorry for the ambient noise. If in general, if you were to distinguish simple from Maimonides to Hasidic, in explanation of everything, and I know you've told us this before, but could you reiterate in general how
Yeah.
they three distinguish from each other?
Yeah. Maimonides says oneness is not talking about creation. Oneness is talking about God. You have to believe that God is one, meaning the type me. You know what? Instead of talking, why don't I read Maimonides? I'll read Maimonides for you.
It's
Why not?
not even in this particular situation, it's in general. It's to describe many of the distinctions that you bring up to us
Oh,
before.
in general.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
see. I
yeah.
see.
I
Okay.
get the
Okay.
specific.
Okay. In general, Maimonides. Okay, I'm not an expert on this, but generally speaking, Maimonides talks about. Okay, how do I say this nicely? In Jude, there's two aspects of God. Okay, I don't want to say that. There's two ways of thinking about God or relating to God, either intellectually or emotionally, but there's two ways. And each one has a cost. But this is a topic in itself, so I'm going to try to be very brief. One, Maimonides is focused on the transcendence of God. God is removed, God is separate, God is apart. And the reason why he says that is because if you think about God in terms that you know, you're limiting God, right? So, for example, Maimonides talks about the fact how God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. You know, when we process knowledge, it creates change within ourselves. There's God, there's the person before I understood, there's the person while I understand, and there's the person after I understand. I'm a changed person. And Maimonides spends time talking about this and saying that God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. And in generally speaking, what he's trying to do is protect God, so to speak, from limitation and change, and which change also comes from limitation and all the limitations and weaknesses of creation. So, of course, God knows what's happening in this world, but God is essentially removed and apart and a different type of existence, an infinite existence, and philosophically, you would say it's simple oneness. But I think that the academics would say he's emphasizing God's transcendence, how he's removed and apart from us. And Hasidism and Kabbalah understands that and accepts that. But they say, in addition to that, God is also immanent. In other words, God is also within creation. He's not just transcends creation, he's also in creation. And Maimonides does not emphasize that so much. In other words, that's not his, he doesn't disagree with it, but that's not where his energy is at. His energy is saying God is all perfect, all powerful, all knowing. But to do that, you have to separate him from our understanding of all those concepts. So everything is a metaphor. His kindness is not like our kindness, his knowledge is not like our knowledge. So we're trying to say God is a completely different existence. So that's what Maimonides is doing. The Hasidic movement is trying to do something else. It's trying to emphasize oneness in the sense that nothing is outside of God. Maimonides is not going to speak that language. Even the Zohar doesn't really say, Zohar says there's no place empty of him. But the Hasidic emphasis is in a way almost the opposite. Not the opposite, but it's highlighting a different point. Not that God is separate and removed, but that there's nothing outside of him. So when I look out my window and I see a tree or I see a leaf, that is an expression of the divine power to create. So when I look at God, of course I can think about the God of Maimonides, which is transcendent and infinite, and that is true. But that's not a contradiction to the fact that creation is not separate and apart from that transcendence. So in a way, they're very different, the Kabbalistic model, the Maimonides model and the Hasidic Kabbalistic model. But it doesn't have to be contradictory. You're not going to find any of this talk in Maimonides. If you press him to a wall, will he agree or will he not agree is a different discussion. But it doesn't have to be a contradiction. In other words, certainly the Hasidic perspective could accept Maimonides and does accept Maimonides. And does accept Maimonides' definition of the oneness, of the transcendent oneness. It's just that we say that's not the whole story. It's very interesting, but it's not the whole story. So I hope this helps a little bit. If it doesn't, let me know. And again, we could talk about this for at least an hour.
Would it be oversimplifying to say that Maimonides believes in the other or over there, and that the Hasidic believes in here and there?
Yes, yes, yes. I think that's accurate. I think that Maimonides, when you say there, you have to be careful because Maimonides believes, of course, in Hashgacha. In other words, God's providence. So God is transcendent and removed and completely different than anything we can perceive, but he still knows what's happening on this earth. And he still cares about what's happening on this earth. Right? So that's that they have to be careful when you try to say, and the academics do this too much, how Maimonides has this transcendent God. But Maimonides' God is not Aristotle's God. Maimonides believes in Hashgacha, believes in providence, and therefore believes in reward and punishment, and of course believes in prophecy and communication between the divine and the created. So you have to be careful when you say there, but the short answer is yes. Maimonides is trying to explain to you that God is completely different from anything you can picture or know or imagine. And you can't even have direct knowledge of God. You can only have indirect knowledge because of the negative knowledge. You could know what he's not. You can't really know what he is. So God, Maimonides is trying to protect the pristine infinity of God. And the Hasidic movement, without disagreeing with that, says that is a very important element. It's not just the Hasidim, it's also the Kabbalah. God is Sovev Kol Almin, surrounds the world, encompasses the world, meaning he's too great to be in the world, but it's also at the same time, God is Memale, God fills the worlds, God is immanent. And the Hasidim, it's not so much, well, from our perspective, it's not, of course, the tree is not God, but the tree is not outside of God. Go back to the previous verse, Ein Oid, God is one in heaven above, earth below. There is nothing else. There's nothing in addition. We're not an addition, because an addition means you can be counted as two. Are you a two? Are we two? God is one. Are we two? Are we number two? We can't be number two because number two means that we're independent and we could be an independent number two. But if we're completely dependent on number one, could you really say we're two? No. You could say there's one and there's nothing outside the oneness. There's nothing in addition. You cannot say we are in addition to the oneness because we are part of the oneness, or more exact, we're not outside the oneness. So again, these are deep ideas that we have to explore and we have to think about. But yes, thank you, Bob. Go ahead, Karina, please.
Okay, two questions I have. One is why, if we say Adonai Echad, when we
Yeah.
say Adonai, why in that expression we are not included, even though in the concept we are included?
Okay,
That's
so that's what I'm saying. That's a very important question. That's a very important question.
okay.
You have to be careful when I say this. When I say that we are in God or we're not outside of God, it doesn't mean we're God, because then that's idol worship. I say, well, I see Karina. Okay, Karina, you're part of God. You have a spark of God. You have a neshama. You have a soul of God. You have energy of God. So now I'm going to worship you. That's idol worship. But what is but so you have to be careful. When I say Karina is a part of God, what I'm really saying is I'm not saying Karina is God. I'm saying Karina is nothing other than the divine power that creates her. In other words, you're not independent, but of course you're a creation. Of course you're a creation. You're not God. But what is a definition of creation? Definition of creation is an expression of a divine power to create. That doesn't mean you're divine. It means that you cannot exist outside the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to highlight this in a minute, and I'm going to say something radical that's very, very interesting, very surprising. But the Hasidic movement talks about this. Um, okay, is that your first point?
No,
Do
yeah,
you
that's
have
one
another one?
question. The other
Okay.
one has to do, I think we already talked about this, but it's like very complex, the free will, right?
Yeah.
So if what how does this perspective, the Hasidic perspective, explains the free will? And if it's free, what? Free from God? Free from what? Like,
Right. That's a good question, and we can't do justice to the question simply because it's a very broad topic. But not only it's that it's going to take time, but more importantly is you can't fully understand it. Maimonides himself says this is something a very big question. The answer is very deep. You can't really fully understand it because for Maimonides it's actually easier. But even Maimonides' his perspective, he says it's hard for us to figure this out. In other words, because even though Maimonides says in some way because God is removed, but if he knows, that affects us. So how does that how are we not free? So the short answer is I don't know if we should go into it right now, but the short answer is we have to believe there is free choice. And free choice means free of God. Yeah. In other words, maybe God is going to push you one direction or push you in a different direction or influence you one way or the other. But ultimately, the arbitrator is you. You have the ability to go against God, A. B, you have the ability to go against your own instincts. In other words, today, the attack on free choice comes from the perspectives that say that a person is just a product of their genes or their, psychological and physical makeup, and you can't really escape that. So, however you were born, ultimately, that's gonna define the type of choices you make. But what we're saying is that a human being is not an animal, not an instinct. So you're not trapped by your instincts. So yes, you could say that I was created and I'm inclined to do something, but ultimately I can go against my creator and I can go against my own inclination. Now, how is that not say you're outside your creator? That itself is part of the idea. That itself, the concept that God takes a creation and says, I'm giving you freedom, that itself could be understood to be outside the oneness or part of the oneness. Why are we free? Well, how do we have this unbelievable power to be free and not be enslaved to our own inclination or not be enslaved to God? You know why we have it? Because we have the spark of God. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, that whole concept that we can go against God's will is given to us, is granted to us by God. So that itself is an expression of God's creative power. So all these things could be seen and are seen as outside of God, but the Hasidic movement insists that's not the only way to look at it. You have to look at it as it was within God. In other words, why can I do this? Because I have the power of God. If God did not create me and give me and grant me free choice, I would not have free choice. I would be like every other animal. Every other animal is trapped by its biology. Every other animal is trapped by its instincts. How could it be that I, the human being, could rise above the animal? Not because I'm so great, because God gives me the power. In other words, that this itself, that you can go against God's will, that itself is part of the
yeah,
oneness.
yeah.
Now
With the
that gets us
power.
to darkness and light. Evil. Evil is also the concept of evil, which defies God, is not outside the oneness. And that you're going to have to say according to all three levels, both the simple level and Maimonides and the Hasidic. So that's an interesting problem. The problem of evil for the Jew. For other faiths, it's no problem. Evil is separate and outside God. But for the
Yeah.
Jew, the problem of evil is a real problem. So we have to deal with it on each of those levels. But let's go straight to the Hasidic level, but on all levels. Ultimately, the evil is created by God, empowered by God, placed here for a purpose, and it serves part of the oneness. It serves the whole. Serves the old. It serves the overarching goodness, right? So it's like making a painting. You have light and you have shade, right? You have darkness. You have light. Even photography is all about light and shade. And you can't have if you had just light and no shade, you would have no photography,
Yeah.
right? So you need the concealment to tell the story. So yeah.
Yeah.
But the ramifications are profound. Yeah. But I do want to go back after we take Ben's question. I want to go back and talk about the idea that you mentioned about how we're included, and it's also in the word echad. This is powerful stuff. I'm going to try to finish. I'm going to finish by 11. So we'll take Ben's question, and then we'll do a few more minutes. And this is actually very beautiful, and it's very practical. But then we'll leave it. We'll leave a few minutes for questions. Go ahead, Ben, please.
I'll try to be fast because it sounds like you're getting to the climax here. But in philosophy, we have the concept, or there is the concept of paradigms, and that and most looked at through the lens of, say, scientific revolutions, where Newtonian science takes an entirely different viewpoint than, say, relativity or Einsteinian science. And once you're in, and it's all a concept of shifting paradigms, and that you can't get outside the paradigm. Once you're in the paradigm, you then all discussions take place within it, and even the concept of trying to be above the paradigm becomes part of the
Yeah,
the oneness. And it sounds like that's sort of what we're talking about here. But anyway,
yeah,
I'll
that's
let.
interesting. That's interesting. I have to think about this, but the problem you're definitely pointing out a problem. Maimonides talks about this is that any paradigm is going to limit you. So no matter what you say, it's limitation. And we're talking about God. That's the problem because God cannot be put in any boxes. So
And
that
the great book on this is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, which is it does a great job of laying it out. So go
Yeah,
for it.
fascinating. But just one final point. That's when Maimonides talks about what he calls Yediyat Hashlila. I think he gets it from Aristotle, but I'm not sure. Yediyat Hashlila, negative knowledge. And basically he's saying that we understand that whatever we talk about is within a certain model, and therefore we cannot have direct knowledge. The only thing we could say is this model doesn't apply, and that model doesn't apply, and that model doesn't apply. And when you negate all models, then you have some sort of indirect knowledge, or he calls it negative knowledge. You know what he's not, but you can't talk about what he is. And I think that that's because he understands that every model is already a limitation and therefore is going to ultimately break down when you talk about when you try to apply it to God.
But even the concept of different
Yes.
models is within a paradigm. So
Correct,
anyway, yeah.
correct. Ultimately.
Yeah.
And that's why they say the ultimate knowledge is that we don't know you. Tachlit idea, the great Jewish thinker said, the ultimate knowledge is to know that we don't know. that's the
Right.
that's the greatest level. When you're really wise, when you in the beginning of your journey, you think about how much you know. The wiser, the more you grow, you realize what you realize is that the ultimate knowledge is that he's unknowable.
Right. And then you're back to Socrates versus the others. Okay, go ahead.
Correct. Okay. Let's go back to the idea of echad, one. And this is a fascinating concept that we could talk about, but there's also a visual that the Gemara says you should think about. So it's interesting. So the point is like this. The point is, I'll start from the Hasidic, go back to the Talmudic. The one does not seem to be the best word to talk about that God's oneness, especially if you think about the Hasidic movement, because one, it does not imply exclusivity. Singular is exclusive. If I say this is the single book that exists, so single excludes anything else, but one does not exclude two, and one does not exclude three. So if you want to say that God is exclusive, seemingly you should use the word single. So the Hasidic movement comes and says that's the whole point. We're not referring to the fact that God is single, which the way he was before the world was created or after the world is going to exist. God is one. And oneness does not exclude the creation because creation is two if it's outside of him. But if it doesn't have an independent existence, then it's an expression of his oneness, but it's not two. It's not two, but on the other hand, it's not singular, because singular would exclude anything else. But we're not excluding anything else because there is the world. The world does exist. And this, let's just tie this back and tie this back to what the Talmud says. The Talmud says that Talmud says something like this, but it's articulated by the later sages and actually written down in the Jewish code of law, in the Shulchan Aruch, which even though he studied Kabbalah, but the code of law is not a Kabbalistic work. The code of law says like this: when you say the word Hashem Echad is comprised of three letters: Aleph, Chet, Dalid. The numerical value is 1, 8, 4. Says the code of law, based on what the Talmud says. Talmud says when you think Echad, when you say the word Echad, you should crown God to be the king of the eight. Eight, he says, is heaven and earth, because according to the Talmud, there's 7 heavens, there's seven elements of heaven, whatever that means. Spiritual worlds, call it what you want, but the bottom line is 7 is the higher planes and is earth. So 8 is above and below. And when you say 4, you mean the 4 directions: east, west, north, south. And therefore, when you say Hashem Echad, you're basically saying God exists and is one in the heaven above and the earth below and in all 4 directions. And there is even a custom that some people have that when they say the Shema, they cover their head. They actually tilt their head. When they say Echad, they tilt their head right, left, back, up, back, forth, up, and down. You could see people do that. The Rebbe did that. And the idea is that you're bringing the oneness to all dimensions, all directions. Okay. What's the Hasidic idea? The Hasidic idea is so the word Echad incorporates creation. It incorporates heaven and earth. It incorporates the 4 directions. In other words, we're not saying God is exclusive. Of course, we're saying that too, but that's not what the word Echad emphasizes. From the Hasidic perspective, when we say Hashem Echad, the point is not only that God is the only God. It's not only that God himself is undefined and not comprised of many parts. That is true. But the emphasis when we say Hashem Echad, what we're saying is the universe that we perceive and us, we are not outside the oneness. The Chet and the Dalid, the above and the below, and the 4 directions, which is basically including everything, that is part of the oneness and not separate from the oneness. And that's a beautiful meditation that you see within the words Echad. And if you want to get philosophical, in the choice of word one, as opposed to the choice of the word singular, because singular means God is singular, is exclusive. One is not exclusive. One is almost an invitation for he's one. Could there be 2? Maybe yes, maybe no. It's not exclusive. Now, we are not a 2, but we're included in the 1. So that's the pitch. A lot more to say. All this can be unpacked. And there's literally thousands of pages of literature on all of this, but this is the beginning. Thank you, Karina. Thank you. Shabbat shalom. Go ahead, Ben, if you have a question, unless it's
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Good Shabbos. Go do good deeds.
Sorry, that's an old hand.
Okay.
Okay.
But this would be great to just have a class on this. I mean,
Yes.
a whole series, because this is fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Shabbat
you, Ben.
shalom.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Be well. Take care.